Reactive Training Systems.
Welcome back to the RTS podcast. This podcast is going to be all about technique, technical coaching, technical execution, technical learning, all the things that you would need to learn about technique and just kind of what our philosophy on all these aspects of technique is that we implement as coaches ourselves. Also in this podcast, this is the first podcast where we've got our newest RTS coach, John Garfano. John has been coaching in powerlifting for a long time, has a really diverse set of experience, both as a coach and an athlete. However, we just recently added him to our coaching staff this summer. This is the first time that we've had John on the podcast, and I think you're really going to enjoy what John's got to say. He's got some really thoughtful, useful inputs, not just about this topic, but about all kinds of things. I've really come to enjoy talking training with John. So this will be the first podcast where you can hear from him. Also in this podcast, we've got Coach Mark and Coach Ross. So it's not everybody, but we're trying to limit things so that the people that we have on and the voices that you hear get some meaningful input. So without any further delay, here we are talking about technique. The major thing right now is a couple weeks ago, we got a 3D printer, which I was kind of like, what the heck do we need this for? But Ayana had a good point about it being like a growing technology, and especially like for kids, that a lot of kids have them in schools now, and just that it's a thing that people are exposed to a lot more. And it's kind of like you could have made the same argument about personal computers, back when I was a kid, or various other technologies. So I thought, hey, well, let's see. And we started playing with it, and it's like the more I play with it, the more things I see that you could do with it, So, yeah, we've had that thing running like constantly for the last several days. So,
are you going to make your own bar velocity measuring device then?
So I could make it purely out of plastic. Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing too, is like you start to find out like, man, it's if I could also have this other skill, then that would be really useful. If I could also do this other thing, that would be really cool.
Isn't that how Squatson started with their version 1 of open barbells? They're using a 3D printer to make that.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure.
Like that.
Yeah, I don't know. If somebody wants to build the guts of it, then I can see what I can do. I mean, the printer I've got is not exactly an industrial 3D printer, So I don't know. We'll see how that goes. Right now, it's about 50% of the time it's building little toys and stuff like that for my son. But yeah. So far, it's cool. Well, I suppose we can jump in and talk about technical stuff. So this is a topic that has kind of been on my mind for the last, seems like it's been coming up more and more over the last couple of weeks for me. It's like every day something is coming up where I'm like, I need you to understand kind of my philosophy on technique coaching before we can get to a more productive conversation, And then I recorded a podcast with Jacob Sipkin, and our discussion kind of covered parts of it as well. And then I thought, I need to write this down. So anyway, I thought it would be a good time to get you guys on and have a conversation about, what are our thoughts collectively on technique coaching and stuff like that. So maybe a good place to start would be for me to try to briefly summarize what I have written so far. And it goes something like, what my goal is as a coach is for the athlete to feel what proper execution is like and internalize that. It doesn't do me very much good if they can only squat properly if somebody's yelling in their ear. And I don't think that that's a terribly effective way to do it anyway. What I really want is for them to feel what a correct movement is like and be able to replicate that. So the whole technique philosophy is centered around creating that feeling and allowing them to learn what it is. And then you kind of marry that with just the overall individualization ideas that we talk about pretty often. How do you individualize technique? We know that some people need a wider stance or a narrower stance and things like that, but there's a lot of other things too. And then there's this whole level of technical execution that's not visible to a third-party observer, and you guys have all been lifting long enough that I know that you've felt that something was off, your technique, your execution on a lift was incorrect, and that affected the outcome of the lift, but you couldn't see it when you go back and look at the video, that there's a level of detail there that is not perceptible to an observer, and you want the athlete to figure out what those things are. I mean, since it's not perceptible by definition, it's something that you're not going to be able to cue and coach, right? So you've got to create an environment for them to figure it out, to discover what the technique is, and to get comfortable with that execution, and then to integrate that execution into the competition movement. So that's kind of the overall philosophy. Maybe we should start there and talk about that for a bit, and then we'll ramble over toward execution, I'm sure, as the conversation progresses.
Yeah, I what you wrote, Mike, like I said, I agree 100% with that. I agree 100% with everything you've just said. And, there's a lot of things that like when I'm coaching my lifters or trying to teach them technique and stuff, they'll, might ask, well, where should I have the bar? Where should I have the bar on my back? And we're talking about, of course, after all the basic sort of universal cues have been followed, where should I have the bar on my back? Well, I can't really tell you that. We're going to have to just experiment and see what feels best to you, move it up. And that's one thing I would say is no big drastic changes, just small changes. If you're going to change your foot position, make small changes. Bar position, small changes, and see what feels best, to them. Like you said, I can't see what feels best to them. Only they can feel that. So it's kind of an experimental, all experimental thing.
Right. And now, just for clarity's sake, we've referenced this article. I tend to organize my thoughts best in writing. So I've written an article. By the time this podcast comes out, this article will be posted on the articles.reactivetrainingsystems.com website. So if you want to, I think, be more thorough about your understanding here, then that would probably be a thing to reference. So anyway.
I think this article made me think, too, back to when I first started being coached. And there was a point shortly after that time frame that I had some things in training like click. I'm like, oh, wow, that feels real good. I need to do that. And there was kind of also accompanied with some initial displeasure of like, well, why didn't my coach tell me that? Why didn't my coach tell me to do this? Why didn't they tell me to do that? And once removed from that initial negative reaction and thinking about it more constructively, I get it, and it ties into your logic here with this article. I think when you feel those things and they click, they're a lot more ingrained into you as the lifter, and they feel better and they become more natural and secondary without having to think about it, without needing somebody to tell you what to do. You just do it. You just execute. And obviously that's going to play a big role into how well you do at a competition. If you can go out on the platform and just move naturally the way you do all the time.
Yeah. And this is, in a lot of ways, where this article and kind of what inspired me to say, all right, I need to put some ideas down here, is that I was getting a lot of questions, a lot from my lifters that's, asking about feedback on videos and stuff like that. Well, so in my philosophy here, you can break up, and I've talked in other videos about the 80% technique rule and things like that. And I really think that this is something separate from that. Although I don't know, I really haven't thought that through fully. So it might tie in some significant way. But the idea is that if we break down technique into two categories, attractors and fluctuators, and that's terminology I'm borrowing from Franz Bosch. And also, I should note that I'm not 100% sure that the way I'm using the terms is exactly the same way as he's using the terms, but hopefully it gets us close enough to have a conversation. For the attractors, those are the non-negotiable parts of the lift, the things that are essential to correct execution for anybody, anytime, things that'll get you disqualified in competition and things that pose a significant injury risk, the basic requirements for that lift to be that lift, So in a lot of ways, it sounds kind of like the major errors category from the 80% technique concept. Anyway, so you've got these attractors, and these are the things that I would explicitly coach. If I've got a lifter who's cutting his squats high in training, then I'll say that. I don't like, there are ways to teach what the perception is, but it's also worth explicitly saying, hey, you've got to bring them down. The other things would be fluctuators. These are the technical points that can vary between lifters. And it's important to note, too, that it can vary for one lifter over time. You may find that this toe angle is working for you right now, but then, next year, maybe it's not, and you change it and you go, oh, that feels better. And then you go back to the first way a year after that. I mean, it's not that there's a right or a wrong here. It's that this is a thing that's working for you for now, and that can change depending on what happens between now and then. The fluctuators, that's where most of the variance is, and that's where a lot of the technical coaching seems to happen, and that's really where I like my athletes to figure out Mark, you said figure out what's feeling the best. For me, I like to term it what's working the best, because it's not always, and I know that you know this, but it's just a distinction that I want to make, I guess. It's not always about, oh, this feels better, that feels better, but what's resulting in your best performance under the bar,
Yeah, I agree. And that's, I wasn't articulating because, a good example would be set up in the deadlift or something, where if you're not uncomfortable at the bottom, it's not good. So
I think that's a good example.
Feeling. Yeah. If you don't feel like you're about to get choked out on a front squat, you're not doing it right.
So, John, where do you sit on all this, man?
So one of the things I was thinking about is coaching, negotiables and non-negotiables, and I really like how you said that in the article. I think that there's the non-negotiables, which is to perform the lift at competition standard. And I think that, that's one of the first things we have to go with our athletes to, right? Is, can you do this lift to a competition standard? And then from there is, how do we minimize your chances of injury? So, I think back to some presentations that Dr. Rory has done, and, working with my physical therapist. And, when you're thinking about the lift, what are the the joints that should not be moving in the lift. If you're squatting, are your elbows moving? Because, if so, that could potentially, first off, cause injury, and two, could actually make you less strong, right? Result in you moving less weight. So those are kind of the places that I go, that I think about. And then from there is the individual differences, right? So, how I squat is going to be different than how you squat, Mike, and how you squat, Mark, and how you squat, Ross. We have different hips, we have different, joints, and so therefore, toe angle, bar placement on the back, grip, whether it be thumbless or thumb over, all those things change. And I really like that as a fluctuator. What I really like, Mike, that you just said was that there's this inter-individual difference that can happen, right? Over time, one development cycle over another, you find that for whatever reason, maybe your mobility is better or worse, or you end up finding that by moving your arms out further on the bar for a squat, you actually are able to target the chest fall pattern better. So those are some things that just immediately, come to mind. One question I have for you, Mike, something I've been thinking about is that, I see a lot of coaches, and I've been guilty of this early on in my coaching career, of just programming the competition lift and looking at that as a way to improve, body mechanics, improve the positioning of the competition movement. How do you see assistance exercises kind of playing into helping the athlete to understand some of these fluctuators and how they could be contributing or detracting from performance?
So if we think about the lift in competition as being a movement problem that you've got to solve, I think that's a helpful frame for understanding how I see assistance lifts kind of fitting in here. If you have this problem where in the competition lift, as the weight gets heavier, you mentioned the chest fall pattern in the squat. That seems to be a favorite to talk about. You see this chest fall pattern taking place. You can, I guess, limit the weight on the competition exercise and focus on not. But the one way that I really like to approach it, and I think it seems to mesh well with a powerlifter's mentality, is to give them a closely related movement problem to solve that rewards them for doing it the right way and punishes them for doing it the wrong way in an automatic fashion. And this is especially useful in an online setting, because I think if I'm standing right next to you and I can cue you every rep, oh, that was a good one. Oh, that was a bad one. That was a good one. That was a bad one. And it's right away, then I think that's better. I think that it's still maybe missing something, but that's certainly better. In an online setting, that's not even an option, right? So how do they get that instantaneous feedback that's really useful for motor learning? Well, if you can give them some other movement problems that give them that feedback while they're doing it, then I think that's useful. So talking about the chest fall pattern, probably the easiest way to visualize it is a front squat. So if you show a chest fall pattern in your front squat, then you dump the bar. So you have to do the movement correctly. You have to come up in a coordinated fashion. Otherwise, you dump the bar. So if you come up correctly, then you can use more weight, which powerlifters tend to like. So it's got its reward. And then if you do it incorrectly, then you dump the bar. Nobody likes that. And so it's got its punishment. But there are other movement problems that have similar rewards and punishments. Like I like the pin squats or the safety bar squat for the same problem. It's a little bit less, it's a little bit more subtle. In the safety bar squat, let's say, if you show a chest fall pattern, that makes the lift a little bit more difficult. If you can keep the bar in alignment as you come out of the hole, then it's a little bit easier and you can use a little bit more weight, or the weight that you've selected is a bit easier, and you move on from there, but that way the reward and punishment is internal to the movement itself, and they learn to feel, this is how I need to brace in order for that to happen. And you can be even more subtle, I think. So one thing that I'm in the middle of this block where I'm testing out cluster reps, I guess. And in the front squat, I've noticed that it's helped me feel the kind of brace that I need to perform in order to handle my singles better, So I can feel it during that series of clusters, and then it becomes a problem of, okay, how do I transition that back to, feeling it on every set? And that's just a motor learning thing, like you get that with exposure. I don't think that there's a magic cue that you can say that makes it all of a sudden automatic. It's a practice thing.
One of the things that came to mind as you were saying that is that, we learn in a variety of different ways, right? Just like thinking about human learning theory, right? So if you and I are squatting together and you're giving me feedback, that's, auditory, right? And then there's the body kinesthetic part of it that I have to now be aware of positioning, 3D positioning with load on my back as I'm squatting, and I have to make those changes. In the absence of being able to do that, because we're in this online setting, these assistance exercises can be great feedback mechanisms. So I really like that idea. But I also think that, typically we look at assistance exercises as being able to improve weak range of motion, supplemental lifts to improve, weak muscle groups. But I also think that what we're doing here is this body kinesthetic part of helping an athlete to say, in this position, these are the things that you have to work on to get immediate feedback. So that's just something that I think is really useful with this heuristic that you've come up with.
Well, that's a great point about the development of kinesthetic awareness in conjunction with weak range of motion, because if you can almost think of them as almost the same thing, or maybe two sides of the same coin or something like that. They're very closely related. Doing the movement correctly, weak range of motion, maybe it's just two ways of saying a similar thing.
One of the things that I liked about that too, how they tie in, is one of the thoughts that I think about, is that like cues only go so far. And I think oftentimes cues, if not treated well, can overcorrect a problem. So for instance, I think back to the evolution of my squat and having problems with chest position and thinking, oh, chest up, chest up, chest up. Well, and then next thing you know, we start developing a high bar pattern for low bar. And now that causes poor chest position the other direction. So I think that's where feeling those things out, and maybe not always being over cueing an athlete and letting them feel it out through those exercises, again, particularly in this online setting, is going to set them up for greater success. Even if you're talking less, I guess less is more in that kind of regard.
Yeah, I was going to say or add to that as well that everybody's, of course, we all know all our lifters have very different personalities. Some of them are very wide open, experimental. Some of them are very, rigid about stuff. And that's one thing I've found, is that if a guy is really rigid about stuff, and you got to be really careful about the cueing, because they won't do this sort of intuitive experimentation unless, if that's the way that he is, and you can kind of encourage it. But otherwise, sometimes it's just so black and white that they never get beyond that or have difficulty with it.
That's an important thing to note as well. And I would say that if there's a part of this whole thing that I personally haven't done as good a job as I should. It's communicating intent with some of these drills, and communicating intent with the movement philosophy in general, which is part of what I hope that, you know, this podcast and the article and whatnot, all that stuff accomplishes, is to say, hey, you do have the latitude to make some small changes to your technical execution and make notes of how things are feeling. And we can have a discussion about whether that's a good change for you or not. But that type of movement variation is normal and beneficial and developmental over the long term, you know. But it should probably go a bit further than that. Even if you have somebody doing safety bar squats and it's in an effort to address this chest fall pattern, then, you know, that should be communicated to them as an athlete. It's like, hey, we selected this exercise. Here's why. You know, we want to develop this internal proprioceptive sense of what the correct movement feels like. And oh, by the way, it's going to, it forces you to do it correctly. And there may be even a weak range of motion type of component to it. You know, one way or another, this addresses your problem from a few different angles, you know, and I think communicating that intent lets the athletes see how it fits into the bigger plan, and they can play their role more effectively.
Yeah, another thing I've run into too is that, you know, we have cues that we give our athletes, but they may come to us with cues that they've already learned, good or bad, from the internet or other coaches or whatever. And if they believe that those cues are correct, then, you know, you have to recognize that I mean, we as coaches, I think, have to recognize that, you know, why is he doing this? Where did that come from? And have a discussion about that. You know, hey, that's not optimal.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mark, I was just going to add to that. I think that's a very important concept to understand the assumptions that an athlete comes to the table with. If they assume that a certain cue will help the lift, will improve their positioning, I think it's important to just explore that a bit with the athlete, and then do it in a way that encourages self-directed learning. And I think that's why I really like this concept, Mike, is that you're encouraging that the athlete is learning constantly about what works and doesn't work for them, what they want to explore doing, what they want to try doing, and then having that open sort of dialogue. One of the things I've been doing with athletes at RTS when I take new athletes on is to explore with them what seems to work and doesn't work for each of the lifts. I just want their perception, and we could be completely wrong, but their perception is so important because they have learning that they've had. You know, I had an athlete who came to me with 30 years of lifting experience. It's a fantastic opportunity to explore what has worked or not worked for them with their positioning. And then are there things that they want to try doing? And all of those could play into some of the weak range of motion programming that we put in to help them to improve their position in the competition lifts.
So where do we trying to figure out how I want to phrase this? Where, I guess one way to look at it would be, how do you see this getting implemented with, how do you see the implementation varying between, let's say, just beginners and your more advanced athletes? Because this seems like a concept that is going to be easier to implement with somebody who's got more kinesthetic awareness or just maybe just more athletic talent in general, you know. But what do you do if you've got somebody who doesn't seem to have that?
I think that's a really good question and really good point, because, I noticed that with my more advanced lifters, I pretty much just leave them alone. They know what they're doing. They've worked it out. They've made the lifts their own, so to speak. They've got all the basic cues covered. Yeah, and they've made the lift their own. They know how to do it, execute most efficiently. But of course, beginners, we spend a lot of time trying to just cue the basic things, which are not, they're not, which is another thing. Some of these things, they're not simple. They're not easy. They're, as you pointed out earlier, they may not feel good. They may not be comfortable. So it's hard to get beginners to realize that, hey, this is supposed to be uncomfortable. It's supposed to be hard.
Yeah, I know that when we did the hands-on coaching thing at Das Gym, and you were working with people on the deadlift, you could spend the whole session with somebody just teaching them how to get tight, just to get them to where they can feel it, a handful of times. This is what real tightness feels like on the deadlift. And now it's your job to be able to recreate that on every rep. And then it's your job to learn how to get even tighter as you get stronger. That as you get stronger, that this tightness aspect has to improve alongside it, and that's an interesting one, because it's got its technical components, but it's also got its strength components too. Like, it's somewhere in this in between that, you're talking about setup on the deadlift, and that sounds automatically technical, put your body in the right configuration to deadlift, right? But it's not just that, it's the right configuration with the best amount of tension, so this tension throughout the whole body, and that tension is going to gradually increase, or need to increase, as you get stronger and are trying to deadlift more weight.
And I think the same is true with the bench setup. Like I remember, the first seminar, I think it was the first one you did, where the first time I met you, Mike, and John Bogart was talking about tightness on the bench setup and so forth. And I had no idea. I mean, he spent most of the time talking about bench setup. So it's huge.
Ross, that's something that you spend a lot of time focusing on as well, right?
Oh, for sure. For sure. Like before I started working with you, Mike, one of the things I did with clients is I'd take them on as I'd go through a fairly substantial review process of their lift and their techniques, and give them a write-up and written report summary of what I thought about their lifts, what I think they need to work on and focus on, and in order to continue to improve. And pretty much every time, most of all that feedback was always about generating tightness. How do we generate more tightness in the squat? How do we generate more tightness in a bench? And how do we generate more tightness in a deadlift? Because at the end of the day, that tightness is going to allow for force transfer. And it doesn't matter how strong you are. If you can't transfer it, you're not going to display it, period. So
yeah,
we gotta be able to.
One thing that comes up whenever you start talking about bench technique is always leg drive. That seems to be like this perpetually mystifying aspect of bench technique for people. But again, I think that's a thing that you can coach it to some extent. Like, you give them the concept of what you're trying to do. You're pushing this direction, things like that. You can tell them what leg drive is, but until you feel it and feel it enough times, you don't know what are the indicators that you're doing it correctly, or that you're not doing it correctly. Oh, I slacked off on my leg drive that time. How would you know that? Because you need to be able to tell, and ideally you would need to be able to tell immediately as soon as it happened, And I think the way that you do that is you practice it. You put yourself in a position where you've got to do it correctly. This is what it feels like when you don't do it correctly. This is what it feels like when you do. And you see the difference.
Yeah, for sure.
And adding to that, the online, part of it is asking. So one of the things I do with my athletes is I try to ask them to video, their warm-up sets, their active sets, and to really take a look at that and review. Use it as an objective measurement of feedback. And when they send me the video, I'll say, how did you feel on that rep? How tight did you feel? Where do you think that you could have improved upon? So it's asking the questions, going back to that, self-directed learning piece of asking them the questions so that they can help to generate that understanding. And then I can give my objective feedback. I started to see you pick your neck up in the deadlift here. I started to see your elbows move here in the squat. And I can give those objective findings, but really making sure I ask those open-ended questions to help them explore it. Because I think that that's, really what we're trying to get at here is that, those fluctuators are going to be so important for the athlete, for themselves, what's going to help them to be, in the best position possible to move the most amount of weight as possible.
So it sounds like what you're saying there, John, is that you need to have this system of interacting with your athlete so that, I guess just so that that level of learning is taking place, so that you're asking them questions about their internal experience and what does that mean? How do they make sense of it? What should they do about it next time? And that you're just trying to create a system where they can learn from that experience, right?
Absolutely. And it doesn't have to be done online exclusively, right? I've had athletes that I've worked with in person, and I've set up the camera, videotaped them, and said, what do you think of this set? What do you think of this rep? And I think it's, as technology just improves and we have, velocity-based measurements and we have, video analysis and we're able to track bar path and we're able to look at these things, I think that it's just creating great tools for the athlete. And I think if we can teach them as coaches to, really be objective about their lift, rate their RPE after the set, and just really take a look at those things, I think that they can actually discover quite a bit. They may say, you know what, on rep 3, I agree with you. I really looked great on the squat and, my positioning was great. And honestly, I felt, X, Y, and Z while I was doing it. And that's the kind of thing I think we're trying to get at.
Well, I thought of an example, I think. Let's take the case of like hip rise and the deadlift. That you have somebody who's deadlifting, the hips come up slightly before the bar breaks off the floor. That's commonly taught as a technical error, and for a reasonable reason, I think. It's about efficiency and saving your energy and assuming an optimal position. And the more parts that are moving unnecessarily, the greater the possibility for injury or just inefficiency and things like that, right? You can make I guess, strong case for why you should not have this hip rise in the deadlift. But if you deadlift more that way than you would some other way, and you can control it with a reasonable degree of precision, then why worry about changing it? Because hip rise in the deadlift, I would say, is probably one of those fluctuators. If somebody has hip rise, you don't say, well, that's not a deadlift, right? So it's not essential to the movement itself. Maybe it seems inefficient, but after that, we're supposed to be looking for performance, right? And the same thing with the bar roll on the deadlift. That's another thing that, for pretty much the same reasons, you could say, that's probably not the best idea. But, and I've had lifters that fall into this category that it just results in a stronger deadlift for them. It just does. And they've tried to move away from it and it never works out. So you know what? Do it. Let's roll the bar then. It's not killing anything. It's not breaking your entire movement pattern or anything. At that point, it's a matter of finding a way to make it repeatable, I think. And and turn that fluctuator into a normal process for you.
That's one of the definitely a common one. I always refer to it as a dynamic setup versus a static setup on a deadlift, where there's some other type of movement leading into that final start position and then pull. Whereas static is just, you're here, you're set, now you pull. And like personally, I definitely prefer a static setup. I'm not good with trying any of that dynamic stuff, whether it be your legs straight and then bend into the start position, or rolling the bar, or breathing from the top, any of those things. But I definitely have lifters who have been in that dynamic setup. And I remember, I would make the error of trying to get them to be more static and change them. And it didn't work. It didn't work. Why does it not work? Well, it's because it's an individualized thing. That's my preference. This is theirs. Okay, let's just understand that because there's more moving parts and pieces, there is that increased risk of error, so to speak, to nailing that like your start position. So let's just be aware of that. Let's not try and force like my style onto you, but let's be aware of what this dynamic setup means, so that you can work towards nailing that spot on the target every time in your start position.
Yeah.
So you would use that for an experienced athlete, right? Someone who knows that that's what gets the best performance from them. And so we have this continuum. What about someone who's new? Like, let's say you had, a kid who wanted to start deadlifting. Would you teach them that, or would you start with a different model?
I don't think that I would teach a dynamic setup with somebody who's brand new. I think that that's something that you would learn and grow into as you become more seasoned and advanced and comfortable with the lift. Especially mostly because if they're like brand new and they've never deadlifted before in their life, the biggest, most important priority is just going to be getting them into spinal extension and making sure they know how to get and keep a flat back. And I think you start there and let the other things trickle in.
That's a good thought experiment, though, I think, and if you kind of follow that and see where it takes you, I think you end up with something like you would teach them a static start, but clearly a dynamic start is better for some people, so what's the process that you go through learning a static start in the beginning and then eventually arriving at this dynamic start, and I think it's the same process that you go through. Most people learn to deadlift conventional and then, some transition to sumo. So it's the same sort of thing. You're lifting, and at some point you go, I wonder if I would be better if I did it this other way. And so you try it, and as long as you're not breaking any of those attractors, as long as you're not breaking any of those fundamental rules of the lift, try it, and see if it results in a better performance or anything like that. See if it's a net benefit. And if it is, then you keep it, and I think that's kind of the process that you go through to learn that individualized technique.
Yeah, I think you get in that point and you start watching other lifters and seeing what other high level lifters or seasoned lifters and people you look up to, see what they're doing. And you're like, oh, well, I want to give that a try. I remember, Mike, seeing your deadlifts when you do those pressure breaths. I tried that and I'm like, wow, this is horrible. How does he do it so well? I can't do this crap. It just totally threw me off. I could not, it wasn't for me. But clearly it was always very effective for you.
Yeah, and that's something that I remember hearing from Andre Milanichev years ago was he recommended learning the basics, and then after you know the basics, then make the lift your own. And that really helped me. If you do that, I think you'll arrive where we're trying to have people arrive.
Which is perfect technique, right?
Immaculate technique, yes.
Right. Beautiful technique.
So it's like learning this skill, right? You know, kind of having like a set of principles and learning that skill, and then from there customizing it and continue to refine it, you know, trying new, you know, things to see what brings about the best and most consistent lift for you. That was something that I just heard from Mike and Ross is, you know, what can you do consistently and, you know, move the most amount of weight possible. And to some people that might be a dive start on the deadlift. And for some people, you know, it might be, you know, thumbs over the bar, thumbs around the bar on a squat, you know, for whatever reason. I think sometimes, you know, as coaches, we can be very narrow-minded with it has to be done this way. And I think it's important to allow that self-directed learning to help the person to, you know, explore different approaches, because at the end of the day, you know, what matters is, are they doing the lift to competition standard, and are they moving the most amount of weight possible, right?
Yeah. Well, just we keep citing these examples, which are fine, by the way, but they're all examples that are visible. And I feel like we've beaten the horse dead enough on most of these points. The last thing that I want to make sure is down for the count is this notion that not all of your technical cues, important technical cues, are going to be visible. And probably the best example that I have for that is in the deadlift. For the longest time, I felt like in my deadlift setup, as I was kind of dropping down into position, that there was a certain position that I could feel my shoulder blades get into. And it felt almost as if there was some sort of a slot and my shoulder blades would slot in, you know. Obviously there's not, like, that's just not a part of anatomy, but that's how it felt. And when I did that, my setup was good. My setup was tight. But when I didn't, then things were off and my position was less than good. So that's what it was in my mind. And I mean, through explaining this repeatedly, I've come up with several cues that all talk about how to tighten the lats and what that feels like, and to try to communicate that better. But that's never really what it feels like to me. For me, it's this slot feeling, which makes no sense to anybody else that I tell it to, you know. But you have to find that, you know, and if you find this like little esoteric thing and that makes a big difference in your lift, then hey, that you have to account for stuff like that if you're trying to take this as far as you can.
I see that occurring a lot in the squat with eye gaze. Does anybody else see that with when you're coaching people, that they find the spot that they look at and they try to replicate it every single time, because once you find it, you get that right position?
Oh, yeah.
For sure. For sure.
So another anecdote on that, I've started to reintroduce back squats into my programming, and I'm going real slow with it to just kind of feel things out. And I can tolerate compression a lot more than I can tolerate shear. So the more vertical I can stay, the better off I'm going to be. So I've adopted kind of a high bar position and a little bit of a wider stance that's going to help me stay a little bit more vertical. And I thought, hey, I'm going to keep my eyes straight ahead, you know, just because it seems to fit better with the overall movement that I'm doing right now. And it just wasn't clicking. And when I went back to the eyes down, that just seemed to click for me. I can see my knees and my peripheral vision, and I'm just happier there, you know, whether it makes sense with the total package or not, you know. But I've coached other lifters who you try to get them to look down and everything just falls to pieces. And so you go, well, maybe that's not for you. So any other final points anybody wants to touch on before we wrap up? All right, I'll take that as a no. So hopefully that was useful for everyone watching, listening. It's something that's really important in the evolution of your own lifting. And I think that's why it's been kind of on my mind to talk about it so much lately. So hopefully that you can make some positive changes in your own training. That's what all this is always about. So thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you next time.
Reactive training systems. Reactive training systems.